I'm going to talk about Lake Erie and some of the programs and some of the activities and some of the research that's going on to clean Lake Erie up. And coincidentally, I started up here in 1973. They had just passed the Clean Water Act. Lake Erie was a mess. I came up from Columbus, drove up here in February. The entire watershed was bare and brown and plowed as far as the eye could see. We were draining wetlands. We didn't know what a cover crop was too much. No-till had not yet been invented. So I've seen a lot of changes over those years. And lo and behold, we've come full circle, and we need to do a little something to Lake Erie again. So the Clean Water Act was signed in 1972, and it cleaned up the sewage treatment plants, but it didn't do as much for the non-point pollution. And so we're working on that now. And in 2012, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is an international treaty between the U.S. and Canada, was revised. And I want to talk a little bit about what the revision of that treaty means to agriculture and to Lake Erie and to the goals of the phosphorus reductions. But before I do that, I was told that since they're going to broadcast this, I have to put a picture in my second slide of myself. So I thought this was probably as good a picture as I could come up with in honor of my alma mater, and it's probably the only time I'll ever share the stage with Richard Nixon. So, we'll move on to what happened in that revision of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 2012. And number one, it said we needed to develop loading objectives for the waters of the Great Lakes, and we needed to start with Lake Erie. And of course, that's the reason they decided to start with Lake Erie. Said we needed to establish load reduction targets for the priority watersheds that are causing this, and then develop phosphorus reduction plans for each country. This Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is binational. It's between U.S. and Canada. It is the equivalent of a treaty. And so all of these three things have been underway in the last few years, and the P reduction plans for each country were culminated last night when the domestic action plan for the U.S. side of the lake was posted on EPA website. So if you go to the Great Lakes National Program Office and you search through Lake Erie, and the domestic action plan is what it's called, you'll find the plan that the U.S. has adopted for reducing the loadings into the lake. Let's start with 2017 and set the stage a little bit and what happened in this last year. Every year in July, the NOAA and Heidelberg and Sea Grant make a prediction on what the size of the algal bloom is going to be. And it's based on an index over here. And they forecast this year that we were going to have a bloom about 7.5. Now these are the various sizes of the blooms over the years, and I like to say, to equate these to tons of hay, this is the amount of biomass that grows in the lake. And so if you had a yield monitor on your boat and you ran back and forth and you harvested all the algae out of the water, it would equal these bars. So this index runs from 0 to 10, although we had one higher than that, I think. In 2015, we actually exceeded what they ever thought would happen. But this year, the index is going to be 7.5, which is a moderate bloom. And that index is based on the forecast of the rainfall and the phosphorus loadings through the MAUMEE gauge up to the point where they made the forecast right there. So how good were they? What happened? We almost dodged the bullet this year. We had a good summer, and there wasn't much algae, and it really didn't show up, and everybody said they missed the forecast. But on 2011, or on Labor Day, August 1st, 2017, first time they had to close the beach at MAUMEE because of microcystis counts. By 2010, we still were doing pretty good. We had a little bit of a bloom out here. This is what it looked like from space. And NOAA has a satellite that goes over. Most of you know now you can go and pull these images off every day. This is 2010. This is 6 days later, 2016. Well, all of a sudden, look what we have out there. And then we go 4 more days, and that's September 20th right there, and it's all the way up to Canada. And we go 4 days past that, and look what we have. So in less than 2 weeks, 10 days I think it was, we went from almost nothing to the entire western Lake Erie Basin being covered. Had that happened in the 1st of August instead of the 1st of September, all the people that flocked to the islands and to the South Shore from all the states over the summer months, you would have really been hearing it in the newspaper. But because it came later, not much activity on the lake, didn't make quite the press that it would have had it done earlier. But we didn't fully dodge the bullet. And this is what it looked like on the 22nd. If you've been out of that bloom, this was Tom Bridgman, University of Toledo. If you've been over in the Michigan waters, Marianne Evans from USGS shared this photo with me. This is what it looked like over there. But what really, in the popular press, what really hit this year was what happened in Toledo on September 23rd. Had a regatta, multi-state regatta there. 30 teams, 1,000 athletes, came from 6 states. So you got 1,000 rowers, you probably got 3,000 moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas coming to watch them. And this is what they found. This is what the MAUMEE River looked like on September 23rd. It's the first time we have ever seen the bloom to that extent up in the river. And this is what the kids found. This is what they rode in. This is what it looked like. They considered canceling this regatta, but they actually tested the water. The algae produces toxins sometimes. So you can have a bloom that can have no toxins in it. You can have a bloom that has toxins in it, and the toxin from the Cyanobacteria, microcystis is the bacteria, microcystin is the toxin. If you look at a toxicity table, the microcystin toxin from this bacteria is right up there with dioxin and sarin and the nerve gas products. It's very, very toxic. But the algae does not produce it all the time. And that's one of the things scientists are trying to figure out why. They tested the river. They said the toxin is not there, so it's okay to row. I don't know that I would have wanted to tip over in that, even though they told me it was not toxic. So this was a race. And I think this race has started another race. And I think you guys are running this race too. And I think the race now is, are we going to solve this problem within agriculture on our own by making our own changes in the own ways that we can to eliminate this problem? Or are we not going to be able to do that, and is somebody going to come in and regulate and force the things that you have to do? Because I don't think society is going to tolerate this forever. And I think this issue in Toledo, right there, Promerica Hospital just built a new building on the banks of the river there. Major hospital chain in Toledo. They opened that building the weekend that this happened. Their CAO has now called a task force of CEOs from Fortune 500 companies, Owens Corning, Marathon, those types of people, And they are right now meeting, figuring out how they can get involved in helping or forcing this thing to be cleaned up. So we got an opportunity to do it on our own, and I think we're in a race. I don't know how long the race is going to be run. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know how long you got. But I do know that that it can't continue like it is forever. So let's talk about what the goal is and how we got the goal and how we know what we need to do and how we maybe can get there. And I mentioned the action plan for Lake Erie under the Water Quality Agreement. It established a goal of a 40% reduction in loading in the spring for both total phosphorus and DRP to impact the algae in the Western Basin. It established a goal of a 40% reduction in annual loads to impact the hypoxia zone, which is in the middle of the lake, which is the dead zone, which impacts fish production. So you got two different goals. Those goals are going to be measured by what's called flow-weighted mean concentrations, which is if you take all the water that goes out the river and you take all the phosphorus that goes out the river and you divide those two quantities together to get an average concentration. For total phosphorus, 0.23 milligrams per liter concentration, and for DRP it's 0.05. So those are the concentrations on average we want to get, but what really counts is the load. Now I've heard people, somebody always comes up after my talks and they say, well, you're never going to eliminate it. True, agreed, 100%. The goal is not established to eliminate it. The goal is based on reducing it from this 2008 condition. The goal acknowledges that there will be 3 out of 10 years that there will be a sizable algal bloom out there in the lake still. But the goal is to get the blooms down to a tolerable level. And that's why they use this 2008 index. This is the NOAA satellite photos for each year. And of course this is the size of the bloom, and the red indicates the concentration of the algae or the cyanobacteria, which I'll talk about a little later. So 40% reduction of this is still going to give you a pretty good sized bloom. But it will get it to the point that it will be nuisance level and it will be sustainable for the biology of the lake. Okay, how are we going to get there? Why do we need to get there? Who needs to get there? Let's talk about some of the things we know, and I'm going to talk a little bit about stream monitoring first, then I'm going to talk about edge of field monitoring, then I'm going to go into watershed models, because those three things converge to give us a sense of what we know to date. And so we'll talk about stream monitoring first. We have, for a long time, since I came up here, that's forever, we have stream gauge data for Heidelberg at the mouth of the MAUMEE. What this data shows us, this graph here is the MAUMEE River for the spring of 2017. The blue line would be the flows. The dots would be the concentration within those flows. You can see that we have spikes in rainfall and spikes in runoff, and that when we have those high spikes of runoff, we have the high concentrations. And when we have those high concentrations and high runoffs coincide, we have an uptick in the loading to the lake. And this represents cumulative dissolved phosphorus loadings for the spring period, and the different colors represent different years. This is 2017, so see, we go along, we get a big rain, we get a slug, we go along, we get a big rain, we get a slug. And so we kind of stair-step up to the point where we have 385, and I'm not sure what the units is there, cumulative loading into the lake from the MAUMEE River. So they predicted 7.5 this year. We had some rains in June, and they actually ended up with an actual index of 8. So we ended up right in here. They were within the margin of error, so they're pretty good on their index, but they were on the high end of their prediction. It put us in the middle of a very significant bloom and close to a real severe bloom. More significantly, I think this was the fourth highest bloom on record. If you look in the last 7 years, 5 of the highest blooms on record have occurred in the last 7 years. Now we've had some rainfall. We've had some big rainfall in 2015. You remember that? 2013. So we've had some pretty good rainfall years in the spring, which drives the blooms. But the problem has been getting worse, and folks outside of agriculture come to me and they say, what you guys are doing isn't working. We're going to do something different. So that's kind of where we're at on the index. We know that we can measure those blooms from the satellite. This is a NOAA satellite image from September 20th of 17. They can sense from space the concentration in each one of these cells. And you see these are little square cells. And this is your index over here. So this would be your density of the cyanobacteria. And the red is the highest, so this is the area of the lake that's on the worst on that day. But they are actually to measure that, and they've got a detection threshold of 20,000 cells per liter. So they know how dense the algae is, and they know where it is. And this is how we come up with some of these maps and some of these values and some of the forecasts that they use. So they're pretty accurate on that now. This would be the satellite view of that day. This would be the photograph of that day. You can see here how it matches up just really nice. So you can see this little dense part here comes right down along there and curves down through there. See over here you got that. This is where that picture was taken by Mary Ann Evans. We've been over in that area. So got good visual confirmation in addition to data, because they can go out on the lake and they can take a GPS unit and they can go to any one of these cells and they can pull a water sample and they can take it to the lab and they can measure the algae, and they can correlate the location of that sample to the location of the satellite image, because the satellite image is all gridded. So very good detection now on where that bloom is and what it's doing. We can model the lake now, and we're going to talk about watershed models, but this is a lake model. And there were 5 lake models that were used to develop that 40% goal. This is one of them, the Western Lake Erie Ecosystem Model. I like to say, Doug, that I'm not a geek, I'm not a modeler, so I can't do any of this, but I can understand what they tell me sometimes. And this model takes into account the wave data and the wind data and the temperature and the sunlight and how the currents move around the lake. And it takes all that stuff and it spits out a map of where the algae and the nutrients are and where they move to. And I didn't run this video because it's pretty hard in a setting like this to get it to run right. But this is a video that comes out of that one lake model. And these are concentrations. We're talking here about chlorophyll A, which is a surrogate for algae. These are concentrations. And this is based on the actual Heidelberg gauge data that goes in on a daily basis to the lake. So what this model has done, it has taken the inputs for the whole year, and this is actually a video that I've just done a freeze frame of. And this video tells you that on August 2nd, this is what the algae bloom should look like based on model prediction. This is the most concentrated areas. In contrast to this is the model run for 2012 This is what the bloom looked like on that same day. What's the difference in those 2 years? Drought. 2012 was a drought year. So if I actually was run this model, you'd see this video would show this bloom starting to form, and it'd get bigger and it'd smaller and it'd shrink and it'd move around the lake. But this is all predicted by that model. What that model can also predict, what I've been trying to do, and I've not been successful in getting any of the agencies to fund it, but that model can predict what happens if we start reducing these nutrients by putting in cover crops and grass waterways and no-till and blind inlets and drainage water management and all the things in the watershed that we know. We could actually put all those things on the watershed, and we could actually run this model, and it would show before and after, and it would show the funders and the legislators what these conservation practices could do. But I've not been able to get anybody to link that up yet. This is what we call the natural experiment. Okay, 2011, big bloom year. 2012, drought. Drought year. This is what the bloom size looked like in those 2 years. So these match up with the model. And I think, okay, here's the picture. And okay, this is end of August. Okay, so that would be a month after the model run I showed you. But there's 2011, 2012. The point is that they use these models to come up with the 40% numbers. There is good science behind why that should be the number. They just didn't pull them out of the air, and they just didn't use one model. They used 5 of them, and there was an interagency team from both U.S. and Canada and all the scientific community to come up with that 40% number. So that's where that number came from that you're hearing that we need to get to. Let's talk about some other studies and what they tell us. And one of the things I get asked a lot of times is, what about the zebra mussels? Okay, zebra mussels are putting all this phosphorus back into the water because they're on the bottom, and they'll cabbage some of this phosphorus out, and they'll put it into a little pellet, and they'll spit it out their back end. So there was a group from Case Western, University of Toledo, several other universities, that a couple years ago studied how important was the phosphorus coming off the sediment and off the bottom of the lake. And I'm just going to highlight the results of that study. I'm not going to get in the weeds, but they studied that 2 ways. Number one, they took cores from the lake, and they took them into the laboratory, and they used analytical methods to measure how much phosphorus was released from the lake. The other thing they did is they designed these chambers, and they went out and they put these chambers on the bottom of the lake, and the chambers captured how much phosphorus was released from the sediment off the bottom of the lake. So they measured it 2 different ways, and they measured how much came out of the soil or the sediment in the lake that went up into the water column. And their results, 3 things were important. One is they got good agreement no matter which way they measured it. So they felt their measurement techniques were pretty sound. Number 2, the amount that comes off the bottom of the lake under aerobic conditions translates to only 3 to 7% of the target load that we want to see going into the lake. So that tells us if we get that target load, that the lake will respond and will clean up, and that it's not going to be delayed, and that the phosphorus causing the bloom is not coming from the bottom of the lake. One important thing they also found was that this was under aerobic conditions. Western end, 20 feet deep, 25, 15 feet. That water mixes on a regular basis, and so the lake never stratifies and never gets depleted of oxygen at the bottom. If you have an anaerobic condition, that's when you get release off the sediments. They did discover in that report that if we got a period where the lake stratified for about 4 days without any wind, and the temperatures and the water temperatures got in the high 80s, it could turn anoxic on the bottom, and if it turned anoxic on the bottom, it could release as much sediment or as much phosphorus in that time period as was coming into the lake in a yearly load. Right now, that's not a problem. You look at climate change models down the road, could that become a problem? Possibly it could, but that was kind of interesting. Okay, the other thing people talk to me about is, well, what are the cities doing and what are all the failing septic tanks doing? And 2016, Ohio EPA released a mass balance study, which they took a look at that aspect of it. And they looked at two things. They looked at the cities and the sewage treatment plants and the industry, and those are point sources and those are permitted, and they know, Libby, how much the permit allows them to put in, and they know how much they actually put in because they have to report it, Don. They have to. Anybody here have a NPDES permit? Okay. You got an NPDES permit, you file a report every so often that you monitor it and you tell them what your loads are. So they know what those phosphorus loads are under those conditions. And then we have the home sewage systems, and what they did is they know the areas that are on central sewers, so they took all the other areas. They looked at the population in each of those areas by zip code, so we have census data, so we know how many people live in each one of those zip codes. So that gives them the number of people that are not on central sewers or on home sewers or no sewers. And then they have tables based on those population, just like we have a table, Frank, that says how much will come out the back end of a cow. Well, they've got these tables to design human septic tank systems. So they know how much those non-sewered populations would produce in terms of waste. And then they put a failure rate on the septic tanks, and I think they used 50%. They were very conservative, I think, in terms of not sugarcoating the failure rate. And so they made that calculation then and determined how much phosphorus was entering the system from those failed systems. And summed it all up and then looked at the loads that are going into the lake from the gauges. And what that report says is that the point sources, stuff comes out of a pipe, equals about 9% of the load going into Lake Erie. And they did this for all the watersheds in the state, but I'm just talking about the MAUMEE. So point sources, they attributed to 9%. They said sewage overflows, when we have these big storms and they have to bypass, and you read that in the paper about they bypass so many million gallons. They calculated that adds up to 1% of the phosphorus load. They calculated home sewage sources, ended up to 4%. That left 87% for non-point. Non-point is what? Lawns, geese, deer, cropland. That's what's left. Okay. We know that most of the lawn care companies have taken the phosphorus out of their lawn fertilizers. So we know unless these people are going to your shop and getting a bucket of 12 that they're probably not putting on as much P as they used to. There have been studies on the geese and the deer. I can pull out numbers. Any way you cut the pie, cropland is the gorilla in the room. And I've not seen this data challenged, but I've also said, okay, what if they're wrong by, even if they're wrong by 50%? Okay, even if their numbers should be double, look where that still leaves non-point. So Toledo spent $600 million on a long-term control plan. Every city in the basin has had to do that. My little village where I live with 1,000 people has separated its sewers, and our sewer rates have doubled. So these things are being worked on, and so this is a big chunk that we're going to be responsible for. What do we know about that chunk? Let's start a little bit with monitoring. And I didn't put the slides in, I should have. I talked about the Heidelberg gauge at MAUMEE. We had 4 or 5 gauges on these streams. As of last year, it jumped up to 15. And there are now gauges at the mouth of most of the smaller Huck 8s, which are the 300,000 acre watersheds. We have 4 watersheds in the MAUMEE now that only are 9 or 10,000 watersheds, and they have a water quality station on those. So the monitoring has been increased to the point where we're going to know down the road not only what goes through the mouth of the MAUMEE, but we're going to know what comes through the Tiffin at Defiance. We're going to know what comes through the Blanchard at Findlay, and we're going to know what comes off of Rock Creek at Tiffin. We're going to know what comes out of Little Flatlock Creek in Paulding. So we're going to have different scales of round-the-clock monitoring data, and this is going to help fine-tune what we know about where this stuff comes from and what we need to do. And then we get down to the edge of field monitoring. Kevin's still here? Did he leave? I'm going to use some of Kevin King's slides that he's given me. And how am I doing? Okay. We have more than 23 paired sites now in Ohio, and it may be more than that. I got this a little while ago from Kevin King. Anybody in here have one of these on their farm? Or no one? You got one. Good man back there. Got 2 of them. You guys are good citizens, good Joes, because this is going to give us a lot of data. These sites are paired, and they're monitoring the surface flow and the tile flow. You see this little pipe in here, this little tube. It's going to pull that stuff out into a box. Box is solar powered. It goes into a sample bottle. They pick it up, take it back to the lab, and analyze it. In order to know how much load we get, load equals concentration times flow. So we have to get the flow. This is pretty easy because we have these weirs that have been calibrated for longer than I've been working, by a long time. But this was a little tougher. So you see they have a little bit of weir in this tile. And this tube, as I understand, and this always amazes me, I tell this story, you probably heard it, but that tube blows air out, and the air forms a little bubble. And that bubble eventually comes off of that tube. And the rate that that bubble comes off of that tube depends on how fast the water is flowing through the tile. And so they can take the rate that that bubble leaves that tube, and they got something up here that connects to it, pressure I'm assuming. But the faster that bubble goes off the tube, the more water is coming through the tile, and they can convert that to cubic feet per second. You guys are a hell of a lot smarter than I am, Doug. Did I get it right? I mean, essentially that's how they do that. Yeah, Kevin, I don't know if Kevin's here. If I mess that up, tell me, but that's what I've learned. So we've got these. They're analyzing more than 10,000 samples annually. The good farmers are cooperating, giving them the data, what they did to the field. And they're looking at that for different sites, and they have the balance where they're collecting even the atmospheric deposition. Crop removal will be down here, how much P they're adding. And then they have a bar here that shows how much is being lost off of each one. I'm not going to get into the weeds of all their data, but there are 4 points I want to make. Number 1 point that I want to make, and this has not been updated for 2017 data, but I think this was maybe through 2016. I don't think the main message had changed. The main message for tile: concentrations are greater on the surface than the subsurface. Concentrations, okay? Concentration times flow equals load. So we're interested in both, but we're also interested in loads. So when you look at concentrations, we have higher concentrations come off the surface. But when you look at loads, we have higher loads coming through the tile system. And this is probably something that a lot of us would not have expected 10 years ago when we started to study this. At least I wouldn't have, maybe Doug would have. But when you think about it, maybe it makes sense. How many days a year does surface flow leave your fields? Frank? A few days, right? Not yours, because you're a good no-tiller. That's right. That's right. Surface flow leaves your fields a few days a year. How many days does tile flow leave your tile lines? A whole lot more days than surface flow leaves than surface flow leaves. So for load, we get more load through the tile. Fertilizer placement. You've heard this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the data Kevin has confirms what others have said, that if we get it in contact with the soil, we lose less than if we put it on the surface. And this brings up one of the great challenges for this room and this conference in agriculture, is to figure out ways to get that fertilizer into the soil without going back to full pass tillage or a lot of aggressive tillage. Because if we go back to plowing, we get that in the soil, but then we've moved our problem back to the surface. So we got to figure out ways to get it into the soil, but not lose our no-till, our cover crops, our soil health systems that are going to reduce the amount of total water we've got leaving those same fields. On average, they're losing about half a pound per acre, a little more from the tile than from the surface, but that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Good may not be enough, though, when we look at the problem in the lake. And to meet the targets, the spring loads, if you look at these fields on an individual basis, we have about 72%, according to Kevin's data there, that does not meet the target load under the 40% reduction. A lot of these are real close. It's not going to take huge things for a lot of people. It's going to take a little tweaking, maybe one thing, maybe two things. But we got a lot of people need to do a little bit. And the other thing that's going to compound it is we have this thing that's called Legacy P. This is a graph Kevin gave me, and it came from a 2016 article. But it shows the accumulation of phosphorus in the MAUMEE Basin over time, and where we went from in '76 to where we are now. And even though we're on a zero budget and we've seen fertilizer applications declining, we're way up here and we have all this phosphorus in there that we've got to use out of the system. We've got to put it into grain and pull it out. So it's going to take a while. ARS has done the 3 years, I think, of baseline, and they're now into the treatment years on one of their plots where they have these paired plots. This is a whole list. They have sat down with each one of the farmers and determined what would you like to test and what can we test on your farm. And so now they'll be going into situations where they do one field one way and they keep the baseline on the other. And so we'll start to get some data on the impacts of the treatment. So that's good. I'm going to have to move fast or I'm going to be out of time. But we have the stream monitoring, the lake monitoring, edge of field monitoring, and then we have the watershed models. And this is the conservation effect study that NRCS did. And we started with a farmer survey, went out to a farm, over 1,000 farmers in the watershed, and sat down and went through with them a 44-page questionnaire. What'd you do when on this particular point? Fertilizer amounts, rates, timings, tillage, the whole nine, all your cultural practices. And then we take that data, it's expanded statistically by the lab at Iowa State under a method that gives us credible levels of accuracy for the study we want to do, 95% accuracy at the MAUMEE Basin level. And we put that data into a model. All this data goes into this watershed model that's called APEX. And it spits out for us sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon edge of field losses. And by edge of field losses is what we're talking about, what's leaving here, what's leaving here, what's leaving here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what those results do, and then we're going to take those results and we're going to route them clear down to the lake in the second phase of our study, which we just released. Edge of field losses, and we can run that model with all the conservation on the landscape, which includes not only what USDA has cost shared on, but everything you guys have done on your own, everything that's out there, by any source. And so all the practices out there, and then we can take the model and we can take all those practices away and we can run that model with no conservation. And the difference is the savings due to those practices. And for phosphorus, between 2012, we did the study in 2003 to 6. We did it in 2010 to 12. We've collected data again from 2018. And so every 6 years we're going to have a snapshot. But in the 2012 snapshot, those practices were keeping 11.4 million pounds out of the lake. And if those practices weren't there, we'd been putting 3 times the amount of phosphorus into that lake this summer. What do you think that bloom would have looked like if we didn't have any concentration practices on the landscape? So, so this modeling shows that the practices can have an impact. It gives us a lot of numbers onto where stuff's coming from and when. In the interest of time, I'm going to say that it shows us the same thing Kevin's data is showing. Subsurface is increased, is the bigger share of the load over surface. And we're able to take that model because we know the fertilizer practices and compare it to the 4 R's. So we could calculate in the model and in the report how many acres, and essentially they assigned a value to each point. And if you were doing basically one of the 4 R's, you got 1. If you were doing 2 of them, you got a score of 2. And so we have a lot of acres out there that are under a high level of management, and they're only losing 0.9 on average, 0.9 pounds of P total. We have some acres out there that are under a low level of management. They're losing about 4 times as much P. One of the interesting things, if you take all these low level acres, you get them down to a pound, you can't get to the goal by just treating the low level acres. Everybody in this low and moderate range needs to move up, needs to move everybody up a little bit. So we just can't get to the goal by just going to what they call hotspots in the basin. That's been tried. I'm going to skip that because I'm going to get a little long. But we can look at in the model, we can look on a daily basis, some it on a monthly basis. And so this would be the curves. Blue would be the no practice condition. This would be soluble P loss by month of the year. Gray would be the 2012 condition. So you can see that we can get a pretty good reduction, and we get it in those months where we really need it. May, June, July, August. Of course, that's when most of the water is moving. So that's when the practices do us the most good. So that's a positive thing. We can then take the model and say, okay, let's put the practices out there that aren't there that should be there. And so they can look at how many acres need a grass waterway or erosion structure. How many acres should have some cover crops? How many acres are not following the nutrient management standard? And so what they did is they added those practices in the model and ran it again. And when they did that, if we put all the grass waterways out there that need it, and the erosion structures and filter strips, we can decrease phosphorus loss on 80% of the acres in the watershed. Drainage water management, we could only decrease it within the model on 20%. Nutrient management, 41%. Cover crops, 65%. So you get these decreases. Then they said, what if we do systems? What if we do it right? What if we do a complete conservation system? And we do filter strips and nutrient management plan and cover crops and grass waterways. We can decrease phosphorus loss on 95% of the watersheds the acres in that model run. So there's a lot of potential. If we take that curve that has all the practices in it and we look at it and we compare that to the 2012 condition, we can get a 30% reduction if we get those acres to do what we need to do. Now, somebody's going to say real quick, that's not 40%, Steve. That's right. But we did not model blind inlets in this. We did not model saturated buffers. We did not model the wetlands that the fellow from Grand Lake talked about this morning. There's some practices in there that aren't. We did not model phosphorus filter beds. We did not model two-stage ditches. So there's some new practices coming online that we don't have capability yet to add to the model. So there's additional opportunities for improvement. I'm going to leave that project. I'm going to talk about a Michigan multiple model project, which now has become an Ohio State-led project. There's phase 1 and phase 2. They did something very similar to our SEEP study. They come up with very similar answers, and their message is targeting is better than random. We need this variety of practices. We need to treat a large number of acres. And they modeled similar practices, and they got similar results as to our SEEP. And the study number 2 will be out fairly soon, and I think will confirm a lot of these things that I'm talking about. So I'm going to pass these. So there's another study. People say, well, we should go to the hotspots. And we have looked at that. One of the challenges we have, this is a SWAP model for the Sandusky Basin from Heidelberg, Rim Confessor, and he took actual crop rotations, actual rainfall, and the red would be the highest DRP losses, and the green would be the lowest. So this is what the losses look like within the model for 2008. Take a look at where the red is. This is what it looks like for 2009. What happened to the red? Okay, it moved from here up into here, and there's not nearly as much of it. This is 2010. Well, there's not a lot of red at all. And then there's 2011. Whoa, we got all the red up in here, and we got a lot of green down here. What's going on? Couple of things. One, we're moving our crops from field to field. We treat corn and soybeans different. We till them different. We fertilize them different. We get different rainfalls. You know, one year you get a band of thunderstorms going across here. Next year you get a band of thunderstorms going across there. So we just can't go out and say your field in that area is the place that we fix and it solves the problem. Because we have a leaky system, we get low losses from a lot of places. Now, if you got a soil test of 200, we know that is a problem that we have to fix. But we can't just go out and find those spots alone and do what we need to do. So I'm going to move on to the second report. And we take this material and we take our losses from the edge of field and we actually route it to the lake using a different model. And so we were losing 9.5 million pounds of P from the edge of fields. We have 6.79 pounds delivered to the lake. Not all the phosphorus that leaves a field gets to the lake in 1 year. It kind of tumbles. It goes into the stream bed, it's picked up, it's deposited, it's left at the edge of the field, it leaches out. So that means that to get 40% here, we have to get bigger than 40% up here. And if you convert that to percentages, it still shows that these practices are making a difference. Because if we reduce to 61% at the edge of the field under this report, we were getting a 40% reduction at the lake. Nothing to sneeze about. But we have this problem that we call legacy P. It's in the soil profile, it's in the stream banks, it's at the edges of fields, it's in those fields you have that have high soil tests. And so what we need to do is we need to pull that legacy P out of the watershed. And as we do, that pool will begin to shrink. And as we shrink that pool, then we shrink the amount that goes into the lake. So that's the, and it's going to take a while to do that. But the only way to do it, the only way to shrink that pool here is that we got to quit putting more up here into the system than we need to put. And we need to put what we put into the system up here in ways that'll stay up here rather than move through the system. So with that, I got one more slide because I know you're probably getting hungry. And I'm not going to get into the details of these because you understand that we have programs, but I do want to highlight some things that are happening in the watershed that can help you as producers. And a first one, of course, is the Western Lake Erie Basin Initiative under our EQIP program. NRCS has committed $77 million over a 3-year period for cost share assistance for help. If you don't have a blind inlet and you got a riser, there's cost share available to convert that for you. If you don't have a nutrient management plan, you don't have enough soil tests, you're not into precision management, you need a whole bunch of soil tests to do that, there's cost share there to help you. If you haven't done cover crops and you want to start out on a few acres and you want to learn how to do it without walking before you run, and you want some cost share assistance to help buffer those first few years to make sure you got it down right, there's cost share there to help you. If you need a grass waterway, there's cost share there to help you. There's not enough. We get twice as many applications as we have dollars to allocate, and I know people get frustrated because they apply and they don't get approved. We're required to rank every application and to fund the ones that score the highest because the public is on us to demand results and show we're using our dollars widely. But there is a lot of cost share help there through that. We have the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program. How many of you are working with a fertilizer dealer that's 4R certified? Good deal. You're good citizens. If your local dealer isn't, that's something that they need to get on the bandwagon. Go through the training. There's folks from the High Agribusiness Association available to walk them through, to help educate them on what they can do to help you put your fertilizer out there in a responsible manner. We now have 3 demonstration farms in Blanchard. Farm Bureau and NRCS has funded those over $1 million. They're working farms. We're trying new techniques. We're demonstrating proven techniques. There will be tours and field days and opportunities to go out and talk with those farmers and to see what they're doing out there and how it's working. So if you get a chance to participate in one of those, I would encourage it. And of course, the last thing is we have the Lake Erie CREP program. CRP is capped, but as I understand it, there's still Lake Erie CREP acres available. Am I correct? And so if you need a filter strip, if you want to try one of those wetlands that he showed was working this morning, there's opportunities there. So there's a wide variety there. We're running this race, and we want to keep the race one in which you pick out which practices you do and how you do them and when you do them. And we're trying to offer you a smorgasbord of how to do it. And we hope we have enough people come to the table and eat so that we don't have to go to a cafeteria where you take your tray up and they give it to you. And so with that, that's kind of what's happening in the watershed and how NRCS and SWCDs and the NGOs and universities are trying to tackle this thing together. Thank you.